Gordon Brown's going to save the planet. Well, not by himself, of course, but he says he wants us to do a lot more to fight global warming, maybe even more than the objectives to which we're supposed already to be committed. The problem is that for speeches to effect any change, they have to be more than hot air. The opposition pointed out that so far that's about all there has been. We asked our science editor, Susan Watts, who to believe.
Gordon Brown harked back to the years of austerity after the Second World War, back to a time when the world last pulled together, then to rebuild broken economies with billions of new investment in Europe from America under the Marshall Plan. This time, he said, the world must come together to build a low-carbon economy. His point is that it's no less a challenge. He'd apparently walked from Downing Street, so that's one small step in the right direction. Perhaps the most startling new line in Gordon Brown's speech today was the suggestion that we might have to aim for an even tougher target on emissions cuts by the middle of the century.
The evidence now suggests that as part of an international agreement, developed countries may have to reduce their emissions by up to 80%. So we will put this evidence to the Committee on Climate Change, ask it to advise us as it considers the first 3 5-year budgets on whether our own domestic target should be tightened up to 80%.
The WWF and the left-leaning Institute for Public Policy Research have been running the so-called 80% Ask campaign, in which they've set out ways based on government models of meeting tough new targets. Green groups launching a paper boat to make their point today say it is possible to meet ambitious targets, perhaps even an 80% cut. And that's with aviation and shipping thrown into the equation. But the scale of that challenge really came home today. Take a look at how we're doing on our emissions targets. Our Kyoto commitment was to keep greenhouse gases to 12.5% below 1990 levels by 2012. We're doing very well on that and will more than meet that goal. The government's own target is to cut carbon dioxide emissions by 20% below 1990 levels by 2010, and we're not going to meet that. We're on course to come in at about 16%. That may not sound too bad, but given that the government set this target 10 years ago, missing it at all is embarrassing. Britain has signed up to the European Union's target that 20% of all energy, that's electricity, transport and heating, will come from renewable sources by 2020. That will mean we'll probably have to raise our target to around 15% from our pitiful current 2%. This could mean that as much as 30 to 45% of our electricity would have to come from renewable sources, a massively ambitious goal.
The question now is, will the government deliver on all the huge range of things that the Prime Minister announced? And a lot of very encouraging things there, but we've got to see follow-through and delivery, and that means coming back to this again and again, month after month, to make sure all the actions are following through.
There have been, to put it mildly, mixed messages from government on its green commitments. Most damaging was a memo to the Prime Minister from Secretary of State for Business John Hutton, leaked to The Guardian newspaper last month. This seemed to suggest that Britain should press for watered-down renewables targets within Europe. The leak sent damaging signals around the world and apparently led to panicky phone calls into Downing Street about UK leadership on climate change. There are even suggestions that Gordon Brown gave John Hutton a humiliating dressing down, and today's speech is widely seen as the Prime Minister's attempt to put the government back on a tough targets message. Yet to Green campaigners, the government still sounds hypocritical. Last month, Greenpeace staged one of their hallmark protests at the site of the UK's first proposed new coal-fired power station for 20 years, at Kings North in Kent. The plan should land on ministers' desks this week, and the decision will be read as a key test of Gordon Brown's green credentials. His speech talks of the potential for so-called carbon capture and storage technology to contain carbon emissions. Yet back in May, his own Secretary of State for Trade and Industry at the time was pouring cold water on the technology in defence of nuclear power.
Carbon capture and storage, if it can be developed, would help, but at this stage we can't be certain of that. There is no commercial scale operation of carbon capture and storage on power generation anywhere in the world.
There were barely 3 lines in today's speech on aviation, yet this week sees the Heathrow consultation on the 3rd runway move to its next stage, with apparent government approval.
So far, the government's been very lax, as have many governments, in including international aviation and shipping within targets. I think until they see fairly large rises in air prices and perhaps decisions like not to build third runway at things like Heathrow, then we see aviation being taken seriously within the overall mix of emissions.
The WWF got their boat to float today. Gordon Brown joked it was old technology. His plan will depend on new technologies. But despite this weekend's unequivocal statements on the need for urgent action from scientists, Britain won't even have a renewables policy for another 18 months.